Some people are not in love with their partner. They're in love with not being alone, and they will tolerate almost anything disrespect, boredom, emotional emptiness, as long as it means they don't have to go home to silence. If you can't go 6 months without a relationship, without a situationship, without someone to text goodnight, without a body next to yours just so the silence doesn't get too loud, this video is about you. And what you're about to hear is going to be uncomfortable because it's going to explain why every relationship you've rushed into has felt like a relief at first and a prison by the end. You've said, I love you, when what you really meant was, please don't leave me. You've known you were unhappy, but ending it felt worse than staying, because at least staying meant you were still someone's. And that panic has nothing to do with love. It's not even about the person you're with. What's actually driving it is something most people will go their entire lives without understanding. And it's the reason they keep jumping from one wrong relationship to the next, wondering why it never feels right. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it is and why recognizing it is the only way to stop the cycle. Let's get one thing straight. What I just described is not the same as being afraid of loneliness. Those sound identical, but they're completely different things. Loneliness is about connection. You can be lonely in a crowd. You can be lonely in a marriage. Loneliness means you don't feel seen or understood by the people around you. But what we're talking about here, that's about identity. It's not, I don't want to be alone. It's, I don't know who I am without someone next to me. Psychologists actually have a term for this. It's called fear of being single, and yes, it's been formally studied. Researchers at the University of Toronto developed an entire scale to measure it, and what they found was striking. People who scored high on this scale didn't just prefer being in relationships. They made fundamentally different decisions because of that fear. They lowered their standards. They stayed with partners who treated them badly. They settled, not because they couldn't do better, but because bad relationships still felt safer than no relationship. And here's the part that surprised even the researchers. This fear had almost nothing to do with how much someone enjoyed companionship. It wasn't about wanting love. It was about needing a relationship to feel like a complete person. That's not a preference. That's a dependency. And like any dependency, it distorts every decision you make. So where does this come from? Why do some people feel totally fine being single while others experience it as a genuine emergency? The answer, like most things in psychology, starts in childhood, but not in the way you might expect. It's not always about trauma. It's not always about absent parents. Sometimes it's subtler than that. Many people who fear being single grew up in homes where love was conditional, where they had to earn affection by being useful, by being agreeable, by being whatever the other person needed them to be. And the lesson their brain absorbed was, I am only valuable when someone chooses me. Without that, I'm nothing. That belief doesn't announce itself. You won't find it written on a wall in your childhood bedroom. It operates quietly in the background, like software you never installed but can't seem to delete. And then there's the cultural layer, and which makes everything worse. Society has spent centuries building a story that says your life doesn't truly begin until you find a partner. Movies end at the wedding. Songs are about finding the one. Your relatives ask, so, are you seeing anyone? Like your answer determines your worth as a human being. When you combine a childhood that taught you you're only valuable in relation to someone else, with a culture that constantly reinforces that message, you don't just prefer relationships, you become terrified of the alternative. Not because being single is actually dangerous, but because your entire sense of self has been built on someone else's presence. And removing that presence feels like removing the floor. Now here's where this fear starts doing real damage, and it's more common than you think. When you're afraid of being single, you don't choose partners. You grab life rafts. You meet someone who's available. Maybe they're nice enough. Maybe the chemistry is fine. But deep down, you know something's off. There's a voice in the back of your head whispering, this isn't right. But there's a louder voice, the fear screaming, but what if nobody else comes along? And the fear wins. Every time. Researchers at the University of Toronto found that people with a high fear of being single were significantly more likely to stay in unhappy relationships and more likely to express interest in partners who showed signs of being controlling or dismissive. Not because they were attracted to bad treatment, but because their threshold for acceptable had been crushed by the fear of the alternative. Think about what that means. The fear doesn't just make you stay in bad relationships, it makes you choose them in the first place. Because when your baseline is panic, anyone who removes that panic feels like a savior, even if they're the wrong person entirely. And this creates a brutal loop. You settle for someone who isn't right. The relationship slowly falls apart. And when it ends, the fear hits even harder. because now you have evidence that being alone is as terrible as you imagined. So you settle again, faster this time, for someone who's even less right. Each cycle reinforces the fear, each cycle lowers the bar. And before you know it, you've spent years, sometimes decades, in relationships that were never about love. They were about avoiding a feeling. But the settling isn't even the scariest part. There's something else this fear does. Something that happens so slowly you don't notice it until it's already done. It erases you. When your identity depends on being in a relationship, you start making tiny sacrifices. You drop a hobby because your partner isn't into it. You stop having opinions that might cause friction. You reshape yourself gradually, invisibly, until the person in the mirror is someone you barely recognize. Psychologists call this self-concept erosion, and it's one of the most well-documented effects of relationship dependency. Here's the cruel irony. The more you lose yourself inside a relationship, the more terrifying being single becomes. Because now there's genuinely nothing left outside the relationship. You've burned every bridge, abandoned every interest, silenced every part of yourself that existed independently. Being single isn't just scary anymore, it's an identity vacuum, a blank page with no pen. And that's exactly why some people completely fall apart after a breakup. It's not just grief, it's an identity crisis. They're not mourning a person, they're mourning the only version of themselves they knew how to be. If that sounds familiar, I need you to hear this. The person you were before the relationship still exists. They're buried, not dead. But every day you stay in a relationship just to avoid being alone, you're burying them deeper. Now I want to challenge something that's going to feel uncomfortable. We treat being single like it's a waiting room, a temporary state you sit in until your real life starts. Like you're on pause, just killing time between relationships. But what if that framing is the entire problem? A large-scale study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that people who were comfortable being single had higher overall life satisfaction than people who were in relationships purely to avoid being alone. Not comparable satisfaction, higher. Read that again. People who chose to be single, like on purpose, reported being happier than people in relationships driven by fear. And it gets more interesting. A separate study found that people who spent intentional time being single, not recovering from a breakup, not working on themselves as a strategy to attract someone, but genuinely choosing to be alone, developed stronger emotional resilience, clearer personal boundaries, and a significantly more stable sense of identity. In other words, learning to be alone didn't make them worse partners later. It made them dramatically better ones. Because they entered the next relationship from a place of want, not need. And that's a completely different foundation. Being single isn't the absence of a relationship, it's the presence of yourself. And for a lot of people, that's the part they've been running from their whole life. So how do you know if you're actually afraid of being single? Or if you just genuinely love being in a relationship? Here's the test. It's simple and it's brutal. Ask yourself, if my current relationship ended tomorrow, not because of a fight, not because of betrayal, just ended, would I be okay on my own for a full year? No dating apps, no rebounds, no situationships, just me. If your honest answer is yes, you're in a relationship because you want to be. That's healthy. But if something inside you just clenched, if the thought of 12 months alone triggered a wave of panic or dread, or the immediate urge to calculate who else might be available, that's not love talking. That's the fear. And here's the thing about that fear. It doesn't get quieter inside a relationship, it gets louder. Because now you're not just afraid of being single, you're afraid of losing the specific person who's keeping you from it. And that fear leaks into everything. It makes you clingy. It makes you jealous. It makes you tolerate things you'd never accept if you weren't terrified of the alternative. The only way to actually fix this, and I mean fix it, not cover it up with another relationship, is to do the thing that scares you the most. Be alone. On purpose. Long enough for the panic to peak, plateau, and eventually dissolve. Long enough to discover that you, just you, with no one next to you, are a complete person. That's not a punishment. That's freedom. And it's the only foundation that makes the next relationship real. If this hit somewhere personal, subscribe. We break down the psychology behind relationships in a way that actually makes you rethink what you thought you knew. And if this describes someone you care about, send it to them. Not as a lecture, as a lifeline.